And we're good to go.
Okay, perfect, everyone. Hi, welcome back. This is Alok Modi. My email address is up on the screen. Please take it down. So many of you attended the soft skills seminars last week as well. Okay, so thank you guys for attending today here, as well as for those of you that attended last week. If you recall, last week we covered 2 soft skills topics. Today we're gonna also move on and cover 2 more soft skills topics, specifically focusing in on feedback, okay, that's giving and receiving feedback, as well as in the second hour, business writing today. So that's really the focus here today. Now, again, please take down my email address. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to help, right? So someone asked a question earlier. That's fantastic. I want to make sure you guys are continuously reaching out, asking questions. That's really important. So even throughout, you don't have to wait for me to stop or reach the end. You can just jump in and ask questions at any point. So I just want to stress that here. Okay, perfect. So with that, let's get started. You have from me again this presentation, giving and receiving feedback. That's what we're going to be tackling first before moving on to business writing. Okay, so let's get started here now. As you can imagine, obviously this topic is super important, right? Especially at the junior level, especially at the intern level, at the analyst level, right? This is really important as you're constantly being evaluated, and as you rise, also evaluating others, right? Day one as an intern, as day one as an analyst, you're not necessarily evaluating others, but you will over time, right? As you rise, you become a second-year analyst, third-year analyst, have analysts under you, potentially become an associate down the road, right? So at that point, you're not only receiving feedback and being evaluated, but providing feedback or giving feedback and evaluating others. Okay, so that covers both. And of course, initially the receiving feedback part, I would argue, is a little more relevant and important as you're starting off your career. But over time, the giving feedback is also going to be equally, if not more important, as you rise in an organization. So we kind of cover both in this step here. All right, so let's get started. We go on to the table of contents. This is just an overview of what we're covering here today in this deck. Giving feedback, receiving feedback, and then also responding to feedback, which is important. It's not just how to give it in, what to do in the meeting when someone's giving you feedback in terms of receiving, but how do you respond to it, right? So that's also a process right there. It's not just to be how you behave while you're getting it, but the response to the feedback, right? What do you do afterwards? Do you reach out, right? What do you do? So we're going to get to that as well. Okay, so now on the next slide here, note that feedback is a conversation. Okay, what this means is that it's not only about what an employee needs to improve upon, but also what they're doing well. That's really important to keep in mind. It's a conversation between 2 people, 2 or more people, could be 3, 4, right? About not only what you, let's say, as an intern or analyst, need to improve upon, but also what you're doing well. And you have to keep in mind, a good feedback session involves both. Okay, not only things that you have to do better, but also, what you're already doing a good job at. So you have to emphasize both as the feedback giver. Now, that's only so much in your control, but to a certain extent, if someone's only providing you with negative feedback, well, then it's up to you to ask, hey, what am I doing well on, right? What are my positive attributes, right? So to a certain extent, it's up to you to, control the conversation in terms of receiving the kind of feedback that you want to receive, meaning you want positive feedback and you want negative feedback, right? You want both feedback because you want to know what you're doing well, what to continue doing, a good job at, and also what you need to improve upon. So it's just something to really keep in mind. Yeah, in any feedback session, again, whether you're giving or receiving feedback. Okay, and both parties have to make an effort. Okay, meaning everything on this page here, from attention to participation, accurate information, it's up to both parties to really make sure that you're steering the conversation in the right direction. It's not just up to the feedback giver, which is what a lot of people think, right? It's, oh, well, someone's giving me feedback, I can't do much, I just have to sit and listen. That's not true, right? If someone doesn't give you the big, to tell you everything, both good and bad, it's up to you to ask about it, right? So, and I would say this works both ways, actually. I've been in that spot as well, right? Someone only gives you positive feedback. Oh, you're doing a good job. Great. The feedback session's over. That's not helpful. What do you need to work on, right? What do you need to improve upon? And vice versa. If someone just says, hey, you need to work on, here's a list of things you have to work on, X, Y, and Z. Well, that's great, but what are you already doing well? Okay, so if the other person only gives you one side of the coin, it's up to you to ask for the other, if that makes sense. Okay, and what we're saying here on this page is both the giver and the receiver need to exhibit all of these points. Meaning, it's not just the receiver that needs to pay attention. Both parties need to pay attention, right? It's not just the giver that needs to effectively communicate. Both parties have to communicate, right? So as an intern or analyst sitting in a meeting, listening, right? It's up to you to also communicate, right? Meaning, and like I said before, if you're not getting all the information you need, well, it's up to you to ask for it. And this is where you have to really be proactive. And I've done that several times. I've gone into a meeting and someone said, oh, okay, here's what you're doing well, X, Y, and Z. And I've said, okay, yeah, that's great. I appreciate that. But I also want to know what I need to work on. Because otherwise, if no one's going to tell you what to work on, you're not going to get better, right? So it's up to you to seek that information out. Now, feedback occurs continuously, right? It's not a one-time event. It occurs throughout the day, every day. Most people associate feedback sessions with, just once a year at the end of the year performance reviews type of a situation. But that's not the case, right? Just make sure you're paying attention all the time when someone's giving you feedback. It could be something small, it could be a quick comment, right? You have to interpret all of that as feedback. For example, your MD, right, might come by and say, hey, John, make sure to follow up with the CFO to obtain, more clarity on the financials. Right? Maybe you don't have all the information at the moment, so hey, follow up with the CFO later today. That's feedback, right? What they're telling you is, hey, you have to do X, Y, and Z, and that's feedback, right? So you might look at that as, oh, it's just a random comment, but that is helping you do your job better, right? It's helping you understand, hey, I should follow up to obtain more clarity on the financials. Okay, so even small comments like that, you have to take that as feedback as well. And then there's some examples on this page as well, you see. Okay, so, you did a great job handling that inquiry. You provided the correct information, communicated very well, right? That's a positive comment, right? I think we can improve the report if we talked with X to find out more. Okay, and that's just, I would argue second one, that's not really positive or negative. It's just more informational, but either way, they're both feedback. Okay, so you have to keep all of this in mind. It's not just a major, once a year type of event. It occurs continuously every day. So just look out for all of these types of comments when people are talking to you. Okay, now, unlike continuous feedback, which is happening every day, every week, more structured feedback is more formal, is what I would say. Structured feedback, this is formal feedback, right? So what are some examples of what this might sound like? Well, on the receiver side, let's give an example of both. So as the receiver, again, this might be more relevant early on in your career, right? When you're receiving a lot more feedback than you're giving, you might say, hey, I like your thoughts on, 1 to 3 things that went well on this project and 1 to 3 things that could have gone better with the presentation. Okay, any guidance you can provide is greatly appreciated, right? Hey, just give me 5 minutes of your time, walk into your VP's office, walk into your associate's office. And so unless they're absolutely beyond swamped, they should be happy to sit down and talk to you about that. Okay, and that's really important, especially if you're not being provided with continuous feedback, like we said earlier, right? If you are, then that's one thing. If you're not, it's up to you to seek it out, right? Especially in these industries, in banking and in finance in general, where it's super competitive and everyone's working long hours. No one's going to care more about your career development than you. So it's up to you to seek out this information. Okay, don't just rely on people giving it to you all the time. You may not get it. The weeks can go by, you're working on a presentation. It's up to you to be proactive and seek out feedback. Okay, and then from a giver point of view, as opposed to a receiver, an example is, I think what you're, let's say you're working with an intern. Let's say, you start out as an analyst, now you have an intern working under you. Well, an example might be, hey, I think what you're doing, what you do well is come up with great ideas, but let's, together, let's work on being able to translate those ideas effectively into written context, for example, right, into writing. So, that's an example of something, as an analyst, you might talk to your intern about and say, hey, let's work on this together, right? Basically translating your ideas into written context. So that's an example of what you might say as a giver, as opposed to a receiver of feedback, right? So it's important to keep both in mind. But again, early in your career, Arguably, the receiving is, of course, more important because a lot more people are going to be and should be giving you feedback early on in your career rather than you giving other people feedback, of course. So just things to keep in mind. Okay, so now next, communication. Okay, as always, of course, communication is king, right? This communication is king. You've heard that phrase before. It can't be more important than what we're talking about here today in this session. Recognize that two-way communication is really important, and we keep stressing this, but it's important. That's why we're stressing it. Both the giver and the receiver need to articulate their points clearly. Okay, and as the receiver, if you're not getting what you want, it's up to you to be proactive and then seek out what you need. Okay, and don't forget about nonverbal communication as well. We're going to address this here over the next few slides here. Okay, so first, verbal communication. But keep in mind as you prepare to give or receive feedback, right, in a formal or informal setting, either way, all of these points on the page. So you all have different focuses. What's the truth from one person's point of view is not necessarily the truth from another person's point of view, right? We all have different experiences and backgrounds. So the same message might mean two different things to two different people. What's an example of a shared experience? You see at the bottom of the third to last bullet says, a shared experience does not mean a shared understanding of the event. What's an example? Let's say snowstorm hits on Sunday evening and Monday morning, right? Say a snowstorm hits. Well, everyone's going to see it from a different perspective, right? Employees who live in the suburbs might see that snowstorm and ask, the first thing when they wake up, our train's going to be running today. Right? Maybe if that employee has kids, hey, is this school snow day? Is the school close for my kids, right? Will my boss understand if I can't make it to work? Should I email them, call them right now, explain the situation, right? That's what you would think as an employee. What about your boss? Maybe your MD, okay, maybe the head of your group wouldn't be thinking about all of that. They might be thinking, there's an important meeting today. I'm going to delay this important meeting if XYZ employee doesn't show up for work. Okay, so that's just the same experience, but two very different angles, right? The employee's worrying more about making it into work, notifying their boss, right? All of that. The boss is worried about the client, right? Are we going to have to push the meeting? Are we going to have to push the pitch, right? So it's the same experience, but again, two different viewpoints. Now, what about perception of reality here? Okay, same thing. So let's give another anecdote here. Let's say that you go, let's say you went snow skiing as a youth, right? When you were small, you went snow skiing and you fell off the ski lift and twisted your ankle. Well, all of a sudden, let's say you have a team outing coming up to build team spirit, and it's going to be held at a ski resort. Well, frankly, that event might not be as inviting for you as it is for others, right? You might arrive with a less than open attitude, and other people may not understand your reluctance to be there because of the accident you had when you were small. But that's an example of where based on your own experience and your own history, you might look at that event in a very different light. Okay, and again, that's fine. It's up to you to then explain to other people what's going on. So they don't look at you and say, oh, well, why is this person, why does this person have a bad attitude? Right? Just own up to it and tell others about your experience. Nothing wrong with that, right? So this is where, again, you have to be proactive and even if people don't ask, it's up to you to maybe make it known. This way, people don't just infer by looking at you, oh, this person has a bad attitude, this person's a Debbie Downer, right? You don't want people to look at you and think that. So it's up to you to maybe make it known that, hey, because of my bad experience as a child, this is why I'm not particularly thrilled about the team building activity at the ski resort, right? But again, if you just show up with a sad face and walk around, that's not helpful, right? So it's up to you to, again, to make it known. Okay. All right. Nonverbal communication. This is, of course, very important. Pay attention to nonverbal communication and body language. Okay, why? Well, sometimes negative nonverbal communication, but it can send a message that we did not intend to send, or can result in an implied message that leads the discussion in a different direction than you meant it to go. Right, so you have to really pay attention to nonverbal communication, not just verbal or spoken communication. Okay, on the other hand, positive nonverbal communication and body language, right, that's going to lay the groundwork for more constructive verbal communication during a feedback meeting. Okay, so the bottom line is body language is everything. You have to really pay attention to all the points here on this page, right? Sitting up straight, maintaining eye contact, active listening. That means really paying attention and responding accordingly. Okay, make sure that you have an open, facial expression, maintaining eye contact, smiling. Okay, shaking hands firmly, right? Initially, when meeting your boss, your interviewer, whatever the situation might be. But you want to make sure that you're keeping all the points in this on this page in mind. Okay, next. Okay, and just one quote here, to quote Emerson, "What you do speaks so loud that I cannot hear what you have to say." What does that mean? Well, look at the blue bubble at the bottom. Actions often speak louder than words. Okay, and that's all we're saying here, that in many cases, if your actions are so egregious or your body language is egregiously negative, well, that's going to speak louder than anything you have to say, right? I mean, just think about just day-to-day examples with your friends. Let's say you're talking to your friend about something and he or she keeps checking their phone for messages. What is that telling you? That's telling you that they're probably not that interested in what you have to say, right? Again, it seems like a small example, but that's the same thing in a meeting. Someone's giving you feedback, your boss is talking to you, you're in a meeting, a client's talking to you, you're not paying attention, looking down, looking to the side, looking at your phone, indicates you're not paying attention, right? So you always want to be sending a positive message in terms of your body language, really important. Okay, and here's just a list of nonverbal cues, right? The list is frankly endless, right? We have a number of items here. I mean, if we really think it through, we could probably add 100 to this list, to be honest, right? But this is a good sampling of the kind of things you should not be doing, okay, when sitting in a meeting with someone. And even these days, I would argue with Zoom, even if you're not on video, right? You still want to avoid a lot of this because it shows, right? You just want to be paying attention, stare at the screen. It just shows in how you respond, your voice, right? All of this is really important. Okay, so for example, shifting from one position to another, just recrossing your legs. A lot of people do this a lot. It's just distracting, right? Tapping your fingers, tapping your feet, looking sideways or up or down, right? Slouching in your chair, not sitting up straight, rolling your eyes, right? These are the kinds of things you should definitely avoid. Okay, keep going here. Now, let's discuss giving feedback. Okay. Choose an appropriate time and place and block out enough time for the meeting. That's really important. Okay, so just make sure that if you're giving feedback, and again, this I know is not going to necessarily apply very early on, right, in your career. This will be more relevant down the road. Right? This is going to be more relevant down the road, not necessarily day one, right? It's not going to be relevant necessarily day one. But if you are giving feedback, then you might be surprised how fast that might happen, meaning how fast you might be asked to give feedback. But it could happen pretty quickly. Even as a first-year analyst, frankly, you might have an intern working right under you as a first, second year analyst. So I mean, right then and there, feedback, right? So make sure that the better you get at it early on, of course, then over time as you rise an associate to a VP, right? Then it becomes much more important, of course, but you have to start early on, right? Learning these types of these skills. Okay, so make sure that you block off enough time, choose the right place, and extremely importantly, can't stress this enough, never say anything negatively or give negative feedback in public. Okay, don't give negative feedback in public. It could be embarrassing, and to be honest, it puts you in a negative light, right? Let's say an MD sees you as an analyst giving feedback to an intern, and you're giving it, in public. You're saying, yelling or saying something negative in public, and the MD walks by. Well, I would argue that's going to make you look bad doing that. Right, so it's that kind of stuff you have to also keep in mind. You can't just say, "Oh, but the feedback applies to the other person." Sure, but the way you convey it is really important as well. Next, here are some tips on giving feedback in a structured environment. So, limit the quantity of main points to 3 to 5. Right, don't give a grocery list. Okay, the size of the list is important. Okay, you don't want to overwhelm the receiver. Your supervisor is going to find it difficult to monitor a long list, but 3 to 5, very doable, right? Pick out the most significant. Even if you see, oh, there's 10 things I want to discuss, that's too many things. Pick out the most significant items, go with those. One thing we mentioned on here at the bottom, you see how it says avoid advice? Instead, share your thoughts. What do we mean by that? Well, all we're saying is advice is, when you think of advice, right, that's top down. When you think of sharing your thoughts, sharing thoughts among equals, if that makes sense, right? So an example of advice is, hey, if I were you, I would increase my productivity. It's kind of like talking down to someone, right? That's not the way you want to approach it. It's better to say something like, hey, the reason your performance rating was lower than last year is because I know you're much more capable of producing more than you have lately. And over time, of course, expectations increase. Okay, so that shows that, hey, you're in it together, right? You're saying, hey, I believe in you. I know you can do more. You're capable of more. That's very different than, hey, if I were you, I would increase my productivity or else, right? I mean, that's more threatening in a sense, right? So you want to make sure that you're approaching the giving feedback from a sharing thoughts point of view rather than an advice point of view. Okay, so share your thoughts, avoid advice, keep that in mind. And it's going to be a lot more easily accepted, right? If you share thoughts, the other person is going to be more receptive likely. Next, focus on specifics, not generalities. Okay, so examples. Let's say that, if your supervisor asks that you bring a list of your achievements to the meeting, well, it's up to you. It's your responsibility to list specifics, jobs, right, specific tasks, and then the actions you took to make the project successful, right? That's up to you. Okay, now, of course, then the supervisor then needs to bring specific concrete concerns and then, bolster them with examples of both positive and negative feedback, as we said earlier, right? So you have to make sure on both ends, and again, depending on what side of the table you're on, you're doing your part at least. You can't control the other person to a certain extent, but you have to do your part. Okay, so that's something to just point out and keep in mind here. All right. Giving feedback. Make sure that your comments are focusing in on professional attributes, right? Employees' work performance, okay, professional conduct, right? Objective feedback. Avoid anything that's personal or sensitive. Okay, avoid anything that's personal or sensitive. Okay, that's important, of course, to keep in mind. You don't want to be, discussing anything that's of a personal nature. Like what? Well, we have some examples here on the next slide. So most of this goes without saying, of course, but avoid topics like this, right? Everything on the page here, right? Age, gender, religion, right? Ethnicity, all of these types of things you want to make sure that you're avoiding. Of course, in a feedback session, in a meeting, even just generally, discussing these things on the job, unless it's, someone you're really close to, outside of the office, for example, right? You want to try to avoid these kinds of topics in general in the workplace is what I would say. And definitely in a, feedback session or interview session for sure. How to give feedback. Most of this goes without saying again, but, just kind of a follow-up from the prior page, right? Just more items you want to avoid in a feedback session. Right, to get more detailed though, any socioeconomic factors, personal association like political views, hobbies, personal attacks, of course, any insults, accusations, right? Avoid these kinds of things. Whether you're on the receiving end or the giving end of the feedback, you want to avoid these kinds of items. Okay, you can just throw the conversation off in the wrong direction. Okay, so now how to give effective feedback, the last slide of this section here. Okay, all of us have had, bosses or team members who gave us feedback that looked like, the various scenarios, all the bullets you saw on prior pages, right? Maybe bosses, team members who didn't always do the right thing, didn't always provide the best type of feedback. But it's up to you as well, make sure you're doing your part in guiding them if they're not giving you the feedback you want, as we said earlier. Okay, and keep in mind, if, we're in a position to give feedback to others, well, we have to help them do their best. How? By, praising them as well as telling them what can be improved, right? And one of my favorite techniques here, and this is something that's been used for a long time by lots of people, is called a sandwich technique. What does that mean? Well, Does anyone here, by the way, know what I might mean by that? If I say sandwich technique, any idea at all at what I might be talking about here?
I guess maybe like giving like positive feedback, then negative, then positive, or like the other way around.
Boom, there we go. Excellent, very good. Positive feedback, meaning praise the person, say something nice. Hey, you're doing a fantastic job on X, Y, and Z. And then let's start, to talk about areas of improvement here. A few items you can definitely work on. We can work on together. I know you can get there. If you put your mind to it. Here's 3 or 4 items you can work on, and then at the end. But again, keep up the great work, right? That's an example of a sandwich technique, and that's actually very popular, and I would argue very effective, right? We do this all the time when sending emails. We do this all the time when having client calls, right? Even internally with your own colleagues, right? Even at Pillars here. I mean, these are techniques that go a long way, okay? Because again, then both parties feel like, hey, we're in this together, we're a team, and the discussion's not about just negatives, right? But about positives and negatives both, right? You want to acknowledge both. You don't want to just pick on someone. You want to say, hey, I like what you're doing well. I know here's some things you can improve on, right? So that's a good suggestion there, and definitely keep that in mind when you're talking to people. And this stuff, to be frank, a lot of this also doesn't just apply on the job, but also in your personal life, right? If you really think about it, a lot of what we're talking about, I would argue you can even translate this into your personal life, right? If you're talking to a friend, talking to a significant other, a relative, right? A lot of this applies in that context as well, right? Because if you have something negative to say, well, sandwiching it in between 2 positive things can help alleviate some of the burden, right? Some of the harsh criticism that might come in the middle, right? So it's a good thing to just keep in mind. It actually works really well. If you haven't used it before, definitely try it. Okay, so receiving feedback. Now, as we said, this section, arguably is even more relevant than giving, because earlier in your career as an intern or analyst, this is what you'll be, primarily focusing on, right? Receiving feedback and getting better at your job. Okay, so this is actually really important, even more so early on than giving feedback, right? You have to be ready to receive feedback at all times. And to be frank, a lot of this is a mental game, but you have to be prepared. You have to have the maturity and the self-awareness to be willing to accept feedback, and then importantly, change. Not just, oh, okay, yeah, this is a feedback, great. Well, that's one thing, but are you going to actually do anything about it, right? That's even more important, because if you're not going to change, what's the point, right? So keep going here. Now, make sure that you're proactive, as we said, in seeking feedback, right? I always ask my MDs for feedback literally like every month, right? There would be pitches I'm working on, management presentations, SIMs I'm writing, in banking, you do all of this, right? Working on memos, setting up meetings, just lots of things, right? Lots of different directions every day you're running in. And there could be, projects I'm working on with an MD in a different group. I was in M&A when I was in banking, right? There might be an MD in healthcare I'm working with. There could be an MD in industrials, right? In different groups. Well, they're not always going to necessarily email me or come up to me and give me feedback. In fact, that actually didn't happen nearly as often as I would have liked, but no problem. What do? Hey, just walk into their office, and if you don't want to do that, email them, schedule some time ahead of time. But hey, if you just see them, in the pantry, if you see them just kind of walking down the hall, if you're passing their office, their door's open, you don't seem that busy, right? Just pop in. Hey, do you have a few minutes? Let's talk about my, performance on X, Y, and Z project, on this pitch, on that, on that memorandum, whatever it might be. Do you have a few minutes to discuss? And then, start asking them, hey, what do you think I'm doing well? What can I do better? And again, it could be a 5-minute conversation, but it'll go a long way. Okay, so just something to keep in mind, and make sure that you're doing constantly, especially at the junior levels. Okay, the other thing is make sure that you're looking at receiving feedback as a growth opportunity, but don't look at it as criticism, which a lot of people do. Look at it as a growth opportunity and avoid emotional responses. Okay, you want to make sure that you build on strengths, but make it a point to seek out weaknesses, right? Because you want to work on those. So if someone's just giving you strengths, hey, you're doing a good job on all of these things, well, don't just stop and leave, right? After the meeting's over, ask them afterwards, hey, what can I work on? And vice versa. If someone says, okay, you just need to get better at X, Y, and Z, doesn't say anything positive, then ask about it. Hey, okay, well, what am I doing well? What am I doing a good job at that I should continue, right? So it's really important to understand both sides of the coin. And if you're not getting one side, again, proactively seek it out. Receiving feedback. Don't be your worst critic. Okay, so all that means is just, don't beat yourself up too bad and only focus on the negatives. Make sure that you're giving yourself credit for the positives as well. Okay, and if it's a really stressful time, you're super busy with all these projects, maybe something else is going on, well, then ask to reschedule the meeting, or you don't want to, it's not ideal to have a feedback session when you're super stressed, or, if you're in the middle of a lot of things. Okay, again, sometimes you can't avoid it, but hey, if you have a choice, try to push it to a day or time when, you might not be too preoccupied. All right, next. Responding to feedback. Okay, responding to feedback. This section is important. This section is really important because you have to be careful here, as you can't take back anything you do or say, basically, in a performance review, right? You can't really take back anything you do or say. So that's why it's super important to just be really careful about how you're responding when someone's giving you feedback, right? That can't be stressed enough.
I'm sorry, Alok, I need to, sorry, I just,
of course.
I missed a question in the chat box just.
Oh, sure.
So we may have to take a step back real quickly. Jalen asks, what do we do if someone senior brings up a topic we shouldn't talk about?
So if someone senior brings up a topic, I would argue there's only so much you can do. But again, if it's, what we're saying shouldn't, as in, it's one thing if you don't want to talk about it versus something that's like illegal. So if you're referring to, something that you just may not be super comfortable talking about, maybe it's a project you're working on, you didn't do a good job, that's one thing, then of course you have to address it. If you're talking in the realm of, shouldn't be talking about like something that's illegal or just inappropriate, well, I would, just say something along the lines of, you don't feel comfortable discussing that, or maybe just, kind of respond, keep it very short, brief. And then again, if you're talking about something that's, just completely inappropriate, well, then all of a sudden that, leads to the next question. Is that something that's so inappropriate that you want to escalate it to the level of HR, to try to really, I don't want to say get the person in trouble, but, bring it up because you don't want that, obviously to continue that behavior or happen to someone else. So, I mean, again, that depends on what you're talking about that they're asking you about, right? I mean, if it's just, if it's 100% work related and, related to projects that you're working on, you sort of have to address the issue. But if it's something outside the scope of your work and, anything related to, let's say, any of the topics on those pages earlier, where we had a couple pages, right, where we listed like inappropriate things to discuss, well, then, yeah, then you may think about escalating. And again, this is where the next few pages will come in handy because you don't want to rush the process. You don't want to just jump to conclusions and, you don't want to just do something that you might regret later. But yeah, if it is something that's inappropriate, I would definitely consider escalating it to HR or even potentially discussing it with someone else senior in the group. And that's the other thing, it doesn't have to be HR. It could be another trusted colleague of yours, right? Maybe there's a VP you're really close within the group. This is why it's good to get close to people in the group, right? Maybe there's a VP you're really close to. Maybe there's a director that you're really close to. You work with a lot. You guys are open with each other, things like that. Well, you may also want to go to people like that as opposed to HR, right? Because they can give you some honest feedback too. So, I mean, I don't know if that directly answers your question, but it really depends on what you mean by things they shouldn't be talking about, if that makes sense. Okay, but again, there's a fine line between something you're just not comfortable with because it's project related and you didn't do a good job versus something that's definitely, inappropriate or illegal. So, I mean, there's obviously a fine line between the two. Okay, so hopefully that helps, but yeah, let me know if there's more questions on these topics. Happy to address.
Will do.
Okay, so next page here. So keep in mind that, yeah, you may receive a bad review, may receive a, good review, but negative feedback is not entirely bad, right? Keep that in mind, right? Getting a bad performance review, it might seem overwhelming. No one wants to receive a bad review, right? No one wants to know their boss is not happy with their work, right? And especially if it's, it's really bad, well, you don't want to worry about looking for a new job and things like this, right? No one wants a bad review in their employment file. But this is where you have to really step back and take time to assess what's going on, to assess the situation, analyze the feedback, and then respond accordingly, right? If you believe the review is accurate, well, then of course you want to use it as a way to improve. But if you think, your boss overlooked your accomplishments and just, said a lot of negative things, but let's say you did a lot of positive things and they didn't bring anything up or just overlooked it, well, then take a deep breath before you respond. And, then respond later on, in a subsequent meeting, for example, right? So you want to be careful about, again, the big picture here is don't just respond immediately. If someone, if you're upset or if you're mad, and that's actually the worst way to respond if you're upset or mad. Okay, you want to make sure you're calm when you're responding. So if it means you have to reschedule, another meeting after this one, well, then that's what you have to do. Okay, schedule another meeting where you can actually, have time to, think about how to respond, and then, maybe bring a list of your accomplishments in for the next session, things like that, right? So let's keep going here on the next slide. So basically, we have a series of pages here on what you should do after a review. First, wait, do nothing, right? Just wait. And that's what we're saying here. Give yourself time to calm down, right? Because you might feel upset, you might feel angry, and that's the worst time to respond. Right? As we said, you can't take back your words. Okay, so it might be dangerous actually to say anything in the moment if you're really upset and heated, right? So at first, just wait, don't do anything. You don't mix bad words with your bad mood, right? Because your mood can change. You might be upset now, you might be happy later on, but if you say something, well, those words are out there, you can't take them back, right? So really want to emphasize that. Okay, so now, next page here. After you wait, okay, just first wait, do nothing. Then read and analyze the review, right? Spend time reading and analyzing the review in detail. Okay, make a list of questions, okay, about what you feel is confusing or incorrect. Okay, assuming you think there was something wrong with the review, it didn't accurately reflect your performance, hey, make a list of questions. Then ask a trusted colleague if he or she sees this behavior or performance issues, right? Maybe you're working with one MD, and maybe it's just one project, and then maybe you work with another MD, quite often. Well, it could be a one-time thing, right? With the MD you're working with right now, maybe it was just something that happened. There was a reason, some miscommunication, and that MD all of a sudden has a negative impression. But then if you talk to another MD and you've been working with that person for on 10 projects, and all they have to say is positive things, well, then overall, yeah, you're probably in good shape. But you of course want to make sure that one MD that you worked with recently that didn't have the best things to say on that one project, well, knows about your performance on the other projects. And this is where, if you trust that, MD, for example, that you work with all the time, well, get them involved and, just make sure that what they're saying is known in the group, right? Is known to whoever your staffer is known potentially by the other MD, because this way their perception of you might change as well a bit. If they know you're doing a good job on other people's projects, right? They might say, okay, well, this might have been a one-time thing. Let me give them another chance, right? So again, a lot of what we're discussing, I know it's not black and white, but a lot of this does have a gray area, right? And you have to assess kind of case by case. Okay, so the bottom line is just spend time, going over the evaluation, going over the review, making a list of questions, ask other colleagues what they think of your performance as well. Okay, and especially if someone else has your back. Maybe there's an associate or VP in the group you're really close to, right? You guys go out for drinks after work, things like this. Well, maybe they have your back, if that makes sense, right? So then definitely get them involved, right? So I mean, you want to have a few allies like this wherever you're working and whatever group you're working. Try to get close to people as well, right? And that's something we see all the time. A lot of people, no matter how good you are at your job, technically speaking, from a soft skills standpoint, it's important to get close to people at different levels as well. Not just other people at your level, but people more senior as well, right? Because you want people to have your back, if that makes sense. Okay, so if there are associates, VPs you can get close to, that's really helpful actually. Okay, because if they can stand up for you in performance reviews, it can go a long way actually. And I've seen this where two people are really close and the person more senior has the junior person's back. It can actually go a long way, right? So I would definitely cultivate relationships on the job if you have that opportunity. And most importantly, remain objective, as it says at the bottom. And that's the whole point of waiting, right? Initially, we said do nothing, and that's because you want to remain objective. And if you respond right away when you're upset, you might not be. Okay, so now you have to decide. Yep, question.
Yes, I'm not sure if you can hear me. My internet has been going in and out. But my question is, I've been in a similar situation where I received negative feedback, and I did give it a few days. I also reached out to other individuals, even someone within HR that I was really close to. And the advice that was given to me is similar to what you've been giving to the other students, which is to come up with a list of questions and to kind of like state my perspective.
Yep.
I did that, and that ultimately ended up creating a bad relationship between the manager and I. My question is, what advice would you give me in a situation where a manager has stated maybe some negative phrases or things about you in the feedback session, and you didn't think it was appropriate or even work appropriate, and you waited a few days, you reached out to other individuals, and you asked questions, and you also gave your feedback that was contrary to theirs. How do you deal with managing the relationship afterwards, where it's seen professional, that you're standing up for yourself, where you're not doing it in a way to be disrespectful?
So, okay, so basically what you're saying is, the bottom line is what you're asking is, hey, how do I approach the situation and not be disrespectful? You want to get your point across, but you don't want to come across negatively, right? Like you want to get your point across like in a positive way, right? As a junior person, it's always tricky because you want to respect the other person. And, sometimes someone more senior, it depends if they're a nice guy or a nice girl or not. I mean, unfortunately, everyone isn't perfect at the senior level. We see this all the time, of course. So it gets tricky. But what I would say is this is where, having people that have your back, knowing people that have your back, it is super, super helpful. The other thing is always have a list of accomplishments with you when you're going into these meetings, right? We said that a couple times, but can't stress that enough. Always have a list of accomplishments with you. This way, if it ever comes up about your performance, you can always point to those accomplishments and say, hey, I've done X, Y, and Z. Look at my progress on X, Y, and Z, right? Oh, you're saying I don't meet deadlines. I'm not, good with time. Look, I met deadlines in every single one of these projects that I worked on this month or this past year, right? You're saying I'm not good with this. Well, look, I can prove it to you, I am, right? So make sure that you're coming in with a list of your accomplishments. And this way, if someone starts to criticize you or, compliment you, either way, you have what you've done well right in front of you, if that makes sense. And so I don't know if that, I guess, I don't know if that fully answered your question. Let me know if there's more on that, that they are driving at here. I can.
Yeah, so I essentially did all those things that you recently listed, as far as presenting my accomplishments. But I guess because what I ultimately learned from that situation is there are different management styles, and there are some leaders who do not want to be questioned, even in a pleasant and polite way. I guess ultimately my question is, when you have a leader of that leadership style, like how do you go about approaching it when you've exhausted all of the advice that you've recently given?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, unfortunately, life is not always like perfect either, right? So in certain situations, I mean, you read about this all the time as well. People were just pushed, and this is how someone is, their behavior didn't change. And, and this, I'm saying someone at the senior level. Unfortunately, I mean, in life, right, sometimes you're not going to get your way, and, it's not going to be perfect, but, no one's going to guarantee every job and every senior person, every MD out there is perfect, right? And will adhere to everything we're talking about in all of these soft skill sessions. Some of them won't, right? Frankly, they won't. We see this, right? Some of them are poor managers. Some of them don't exhibit all of these soft skills. Some of them don't give feedback the way they should be giving feedback, right? They may only focus on negatives. They may only focus on positives. I've seen all of this on the job. So you're not going to find everything we're going through here. It's not like every senior person, every VP, every MD has all these skills. In fact, a lot of them don't. frankly. So I see what you're doing. And the biggest thing I could just say to that is you can only control yourself. You can't control the other person. So, do the best you can. And if it gets so bad that, you're doing a really good job, you're doing well, you are, other people at junior level also see that you are, but, one or two senior people don't. And there's nothing you can do to change their minds. Yeah, they could be tainted with some bias, right? They might be biased with some, with some kind of preconceived notions, things like that you may not be able to change. So then I would definitely think about, maybe switching teams, switching jobs, things like that. I mean, again, that's an extreme case, but just to be honest, I mean, at the end of the day, we see this too, right? Hey, this job just isn't for that person, or this group just isn't for that person, right? This is why we also say when you're interviewing initially, it's not just about the company overall, meaning, hey, it's Goldman Sachs, it's JP Morgan, it's Bank of America. Okay, well, that's all that matters. Well, no, not really. What really matters is the people you're working with, the groups you're working in, right? Because if you don't get along with them, then it doesn't really matter what the company's name is, right? So what I would say the most important thing when you're interviewing is, in general, just keep this in mind for the future, whether it's now or 10 years from now. The most important thing is it's the people you're working with. That's going to really make or break how you're doing, the feedback you're getting, whether you're getting promoted. All of that's going to have to do with the people you're working with directly. Okay, not someone that's, not the CEO, right? Not this head of another group, or right, even your group. It's going to be the VPs in your group, the associates in your group, the MDs in your group, right? So you have to really make sure that you get along with them, right? Because again, I see what you're saying. If someone's stubborn and they just don't, they don't follow what you're saying and they don't care, and they're just doing what they're doing and that's it, they're not going to listen to you. Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, there's only so much you can do, but unfortunately in life, that's where sometimes you just have to wake up and say, you know what, this team isn't right for me. Maybe I should switch teams within the bank. Hey, this group isn't right for me. Potentially, it's a small company. Maybe the company isn't right for you, right? If that's how a lot of the senior people are. So again, that's may not be the best answer you want to hear, but in life, you can't always win in these types of situations. And I've seen this where it just may not be a right fit. If someone senior or multiple people in that group senior are just very stubborn and not willing to listen to you at all. So that's just the reality of the situation. But like I said, you can only control what you're doing, right? What you're doing, what you're saying. So you do the best you can, and then hope for the best, of course. If the other person doesn't listen, if you send them a list of your accomplishments and they delete your email, what are you going to do, right? If you walk in and say, hey, I need to schedule time, and they say, nope, I don't have time for the next 6 months. I don't have 5 minutes in the next 6 months. What can you do? I mean, again, situations like that are extreme, but if it's an extreme situation, then there's only so much you can do is unfortunately the reality of it. So, but I mean, hopefully the items in this deck help in terms of guiding you in the right direction. But yeah, I mean, in extreme cases, no presentation like this is going to fix it, right? Because again, feedback is about 2 or more people. You know what I mean? So you can do the best you can, and you can't control the other person is at a certain point. And that's just, again, the reality of it. So, all right. So next, if you disagree with feedback and decide to meet with your boss, keep these points in mind. You remain objective, acknowledge any valid criticism, discuss your plans to improve, bring up any inaccuracies and back them with examples. And again, to your point, you do all of this, you acknowledge any criticism, discuss your plans, bring up inaccuracies that they may have mentioned, and back them up with examples. And they still don't listen, what can you do, right? They say, oh, you have poor time management skills. You provide hard proof that, nope, I've met every single deadline. I've showed up to every single conference call and meeting and all of this well ahead of time, 15 minutes early, every single one. And they still don't listen. What can you do? You know what I mean? So at the end of the day, as long as you provide proof in writing, that's pretty much what you can do. And then that's what I would do in a feedback session when you meet up with your boss again. If your boss says, hey, you don't get along with colleagues, you don't get along with the other VPs and associates, well, provide examples, right? And I've seen this as well on the job. This could potentially be the result of one poor relationship with one VP, despite having 20 good relationships with all the other analysts, associates, VPs, and MDs in the group, right? The one bad relationship you have with this one particular VP might be clouding, your boss's judgment, right? It might be the reason that that comment even exists in the feedback, that you don't get along with colleagues. It could be the relationship with one person, right? So it's up to you to then say, okay, well, no, I'm going to go and, make sure that this is clear up, and then make it clear that, yeah, you do have a good relationship with pretty much everyone else in the group, right? And so, I mean, to a certain extent, you have to really write down a lot of this, because you may not remember everything, but document all of this is what I would say, right? So go around, talk to the different, VPs, MDs, associates, and, if you're friendly with all of them, have a good relationship, well, that means a lot more than having a bad relationship with one person, right? But it's up to you. I mean, the person giving you feedback may not know all of this, right? So it's up to you to actually document this and improve it. Yeah, and of course, leave negative body language at home, right? Just be aware that any, that's subtle hints of what you're feeling will show. So just be objective again, really important. Obviously, this goes without saying, don't lose your temper, don't throw things, don't cry, don't make excuses, right? Don't be sarcastic. We see this a lot as well. Just keep in mind that sarcasm will, of course, exacerbate the situation, right? It's going to worsen the situation. Okay, just don't show emotions one way or the other, right? It's just going to show that you don't really have the maturity to handle the job. And in something like finance, where it's a very high pressure, super competitive, cutthroat industry, you don't want emotions to get in the way of your feedback, of your performance. Okay, next, after the meeting, follow up. Important to follow up. Show that you're acknowledging, your meeting, and that you're working on improving. Okay, send your boss an email. You don't just send them a text message, right? Just make sure it's a formal email. You don't just shoot them a text, right, or a message on social media or something. Make sure that you're actually communicating via email, right? Or even walk into their office if you really want. But again, the advantage of email is it's in writing, right? That's actually the really important thing I keep emphasizing. If things are in writing, it's written, it's cast in stone, it's proof. Okay, as opposed to just conversational where someone might forget. Okay, so that's why we're saying, put it in writing, print it out, keep it in a safe place. If you need evidence down the road, to back up claims that you've taken steps to improve your performance, well, you got it, right? You sent the email and you printed it out. Okay, so that concludes this session here. We have some appendix concepts in the back with some questions. And what you really want to do is, especially on the receiving feedback side more than the giving section, right? So pages 36, 37 here. You want to go through these questions and you want to just self-assess, right? So you guys can do this as well when you have some time post-session, but go through all of this, really acknowledge, keep this handy with you even as you, start internships, full-time jobs going forward. But, just keep track of this and answer the questions. And if you answer primarily with rarely or sometimes, your feedback session, your feedback skills could really use development, right? If you answered most of the questions with often, the third column here, well then, your skills for receiving feedback are pretty good. Okay, they're pretty well developed. So just things to keep in mind here. I would definitely just have this handy. And the same thing on the giving feedback side, we have a couple of pages of questions. If you, again, answer often with most of them, that's a good thing. If you answer rarely, or sometimes for most of them, then definitely your skills can improve. And that's what we're saying here. Okay, so again, finally, to conclude at the last slide here, feedback's a two-way street, right? Early in your career, understanding how to receive feedback is far more relevant and important. But eventually, down the road, as you rise, giving feedback becomes just as relevant and important. So that's why we cover both in this presentation. But early on, definitely focus more on the receiving feedback side. All right, guys, that concludes this session. Let's take a 5-minute pause. Then we're going to get into business writing. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, just take a 5-minute pause, grab some coffee, a restroom break, whatever you need. Come back in 5 minutes. It's 3 p.m. Eastern right now. Just come back by 3:05 Eastern, and then we're going to get started with business writing. Okay, thank you.
All right, you're good.
Perfect, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to be covering business writing now. Okay, so we're going to start off by introducing why we need to be able to write effectively. Why is being an effective writer critical in the business world? That's the question. As you know, this all boils down to communication. And being able to communicate effectively is, of course, super important. Okay, especially in certain areas more than others. But if you're in equity research, you're writing research reports. If you're in banking, you're working on CIMs, on confidential information memoranda, right? You're putting together management presentations, writing emails constantly, right? At the end of the day, nearly everything you're doing involves some level of writing. Okay, and this applies again to all forms of communication, whether it's just a simple email, whether it's internal or external, meaning internally to, maybe your associate, or externally to a client. Could be a pitch, an internal committee memo, meaning, equity memo, M&A memo. Could be an engagement letter, a teaser, right, before you send out the SIM. Could be the SIM itself, could be the management presentation, a roadshow presentation, right? Maybe you're working on an IPO, right? So at the end of the day, every single thing I just mentioned, they all involve some level of writing. Of course, some more than others. If it's a 50-page confidential information memoranda, well, sure, that's going to be significantly more detailed than a quick email. But the bottom line is writing is important either way. Okay, and just keep in mind, different types of business documents require different approaches, right? Just like, in life, different types of communications are, relevant to different social functions, right? You go out with your family or friends. The way you communicate could be very different than if you're going to a, formal gala, for example, right? Or a, let's say a business dinner, right? The way you communicate will be very different, right? If you're with your family or friends, right? So this is why it's the same thing on the job, right? It differs as well. An email could be very different. An email to your associate could be very different than, the way you would speak at a client dinner, for example, right? So just things to keep in mind. Again, in both cases, you have to have some level of formality because it's related to work, but there's, of course, still, to be honest, the difference between writing an email to your associate, or another analyst, as opposed to the CEO of one of your clients, right? Apples and oranges. Okay, so now, here's a grocery list of the topics we're covering. We're going to begin with why business writing is important, followed by the outlining process, then get into paragraph and sentence structure, okay, editing, and then details around various grammatical points to keep in mind as you write. Things like commas, pronouns, apostrophes, right? Things like this. Okay, so now, why is business writing important? Well, we mentioned it earlier, but just think about how often you're writing, right? Constantly, right? You're sending emails, text messages, putting something on LinkedIn, creating a PowerPoint presentation, a document in Word, right? A memo, a SIM. You're constantly writing. And the other thing to keep in mind is, and this especially goes for things like text messages and emails, remember that you never know who's going to ultimately read what you write. The person you send it to, you might see, oh, as an intern, I'm just sending it to my analyst and that's it. How do you know that analyst is not going to forward it on to the associate who may be busy with something else, and then forwards it on to, his or her MD to look at? Well, now all of a sudden, as an intern, your email just went to the MD, and you thought it was just going to another analyst, right? Someone maybe just one level above you as opposed to 4 or 5, right? So it's things like that you have to keep in mind, even if you're sending simple text messages or emails. You never know ultimately who's going to read what you write, right? So take the extra time to make sure there's no errors in what you're writing. And make sure that you're writing concisely and accurately, right? Don't waste the time, the time, of the reader, right, to entangle what you're trying to write because you didn't think it through carefully, right? So organize what you're writing carefully ahead of time, think it through, and then hit send. Okay, and that goes for not just formal documents, but emails as well. Okay, so here are common attributes of effective writing. Okay, not reading every bullet here, but the big picture is, while all of these are important, you have to tailor the approach to the type of document you're writing. Okay, so, but of course, either way, sure, no slang, no jargon, of course, that goes without saying. Abbreviations, well, I would argue, hey, if it's a text message, maybe abbreviations are okay. In a formal document, definitely not. Okay, so, for example, in an M&A pitch, lots of bullets in PowerPoint, right? You don't have full sentences, just bullet points, right? Phrases on each slide. Whereas a sell-side SIM would have anywhere from, I've seen anywhere from 20 to 100 pages of text, right? Typed out in Word, right? So, basically I've worked on SIMs that are 20, 25 pages. I've worked on SIMs that are frankly over 100 pages, right? In my time in banking. So at the end of the day, those documents, of course, are going to be a lot more formal and well organized rather than a quick text message or an email. Okay, here are more common attributes of effective writing. There's one thing I do want to point out here, actually, again, not reading every bullet, but what I do want to point out is that too many people actually rely on spell check, and we're gonna have more on this later as well, but spell check's not enough, right? Neither is grammar check. PowerPoint has it, Word has it. Don't rely on them. You can't, right? Because at the end of the day, your words can technically be spelled correctly, but they might be used incorrectly. Well, spell check may not pick up on that, right? And there's examples later we'll see, but one example is there, right? Is it THEIR? Is it THERE? Is it THEY''RE? Right? There's 3 types of theirs, right? So Word may not recognize if you are not using the right one based on the context, right? So it's things like that that I've seen people really get screwed on, right? Because they rely on it, and all of a sudden there's still 10 mistakes, spelling mistakes on the page, but they didn't catch any of them. Okay, and especially goes for things like emails, right? In a Word document, people are generally more careful, not always, but generally, but especially in emails and text messages, things like that. You want to put extra time in to make sure that what you're writing is perfect. Okay, so now, effective design. Okay, design's everything. Don't overlook this component. Okay, spending a few minutes here will make everything a lot easier and fluid. Okay, and the idea here is, the big picture is that you want to draw the reader in from the beginning, right? You literally have a few seconds to tell the reader to engage with the document. So if they open it up and first 20, 30 seconds, they're confused, they're lost, they're bored, right? They're annoyed, whatever it might be, because things are not organized, well laid out. That's it. The other 5 pages or 50 pages, whatever it is, you've already lost the person, right? And they're not going to be as engaged. So I would argue design is important throughout your document, but especially at the beginning, actually, you literally have only a few seconds to really capture the reader's attention. Right? So that's where you got to get it right. Again, spending extra time there, really important, especially up front. Okay, effective design, it entails essentially all the points on this page. Right? A nice, clean document, make sure it's centered, make sure the layout is clear, right? The bullet points, having bullet points are important as well every now and then, right? To lay out lists. Don't overdo it with bullets, but every now and then when you have a nice list, you want to lay out, put it in bullet points. Okay, make sure there's enough white space between paragraphs. Okay, and that's really important, actually. Sometimes we see people crowding things on a document, right? White space like air, right? That's more to keep in mind. It's like air. It's necessary for a design to breathe. Okay, it sounds cheesy, but it's true. Okay, white space is basically like air, right? It's necessary for the design to breathe. You crowd everything, you cramp everything in one spot. It's just too hard to read, and you get lost very easily. Getting confused. So you want to make sure, meaning as the reader. So you want to make sure that there's plenty of white space. I'd rather have a 20-page document that has a lot of white space, things are spaced out, looks nice, rather than 15 pages where everything is cramped together. All right, now let's discuss the outlining process here. You always create an outline first. You always create an outline first. Why start with an outline though? Well, if you start with an outline, you don't have to actually write in logical order. You can jump around in the outline, right, when you start writing the document. It's like shooting a film, right? You don't have to shoot the film in sequential order, but you do have to have the storyboard in place to guide you, right? And as long as in the end, everything flows in logical order, hey, you're good to go. You can actually shoot the film in any order you want, right? You can shoot the first scene first. You can shoot the last scene first if you want. You can shoot some middle scenes first, do the first scene at the end. Doesn't matter, as long as once you're done, you put everything in logical order, you're good to go. It's the same concept when it comes to writing. Okay, make sure that you write all your thoughts down. Okay, you can always refine later, but the idea here is you don't want to leave out thoughts you have at this point in the process. Okay, brainstorm and put everything on paper at the moment. You start with the main sentence, underneath it, list the topics and subtopics, and do that for for everything, for all of the topics throughout the document. You write everything you come up with while brainstorming. That's the bottom line. Then you may have one draft up the outline. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. Okay, now decide on an order for all the information. Okay, so meaning what? How is your document laid out? You have to know that up front. Okay, so will it be order of importance? Chronological order? Simple to complex, meaning, the easy stuff discussed up front. All the details, the complicated jargon, all of that, save it for later, right? You need some order for the organization. It can't be random, right? There has to be some order for the organization. Okay, notice that, and one thing I want to just point out as well, you should always save each draft of the outline. Okay, I really want to stress this as you're starting out, because this is something we see causes disasters for people. And this actually applies to anything you're working on, whether it's a Word document, Excel file, PowerPoint presentation. Always save up what you're doing constantly. Always save up what you're doing. Okay, that's really important, because you might lose your document at some point. You might, you might overwrite it, you might lose it, might delete it. So always save up what you're doing. Really important. You might want to go back and take a second look at it. And if you deleted it, well, it's gone forever. Okay, the other thing is you could add charts, graphs, things like this to an outline as well. But the same rules apply. Make sure all the supporting information ties to the main point. Don't add something for the sake of adding it. Add it if it actually, helps you support the main point. Now, here's an example of a sample outline form. Right, so you have the main topic, the subtopic of one, second subtopic of one, right? Then subtopic of B, and so on and so forth. Okay, so for example, in a confidential information memorandum, a common order for the outline would be, the first section is typically the executive summary. The next could be, company overview, for example. The next section might be about the growth strategy. Let's say you're on a sell-side transaction, you put together a 100-page document detailing the company you're helping to sell, right? What would it look like? Well, executive summary, company overview, right? Then you might have growth strategy, then you might have industry overview. Finally, you might have the financial highlights. That's typically towards the end in most SIMs that I've seen. You have the financials towards the end in one of the last sections. And then maybe you have a recommendation at the end as well, right? So that's generally a kind of a general order for a SIM. Right? Again, two of those sections, maybe they're flipped, maybe you have another section in there, maybe one of these isn't in there, but in general, that's overall the most common structure for a SIM. Okay, with the executive summary up front, with the financial highlights typically towards the end. Okay, notice the blue bubble at the bottom here. Can't emphasize this enough. The organization and flow are everything. Even the best writing cannot overcome poor organization. And that's why it says here, good organization can potentially overcome weak writing. But good writing cannot overcome weak organization. Right? The bottom line is if the document's organized, very nicely and it's in logical order, everything makes sense. Even if you're not the best writer, I would argue you're in a better spot than if you're an amazing writer, but the document's poorly organized, because then people can't follow. It doesn't matter if the sentences and the grammar and all that is very well constructed and proper. And if overall the document doesn't flow and it's not organized properly, you're jumping around everywhere, right? It doesn't matter how well written every individual sentence is, the person's just going to have a hard time following the overall document, right? So the structure of the document, the organization trumps everything else. And that's why, again, outlining is really important to get that structure in place first. Okay, now let's discuss paragraph and document structure here, a few slides on this. Okay, so the topic sentence here, that's critical as it sets the tone for the entire paragraph. It controls the content of the paragraph. Okay, ensure that everything after the topic sentence either directly or indirectly relates to that topic. Make sure you're not wandering off on tangents. That's important, right? Stick to the key points you're trying to make. Now, following the topic sentence, a paragraph should include, and then you see all the bullets here, right? At least two sentences directly supporting the topic, a transition to the next paragraph or a conclusion that repeats the topic sentence. The bottom line is the rest of the paragraph should support that topic sentence. Okay. And note that your first paragraph should be somewhat concise. But you want the reader to take the time to read your document. Okay, not glance at it, see the giant block of writing in the first paragraph, be turned off, and then skip over it, right? And then go somewhere else. So you really want to make sure while the entire document is well organized and inviting to the reader, you especially put emphasis and focus on that first paragraph, on that first page. Yeah, on the first paragraph, on the first page or two, I would say that's really the most important. Because again, if it's like anything else, the first few minutes mean a lot. It's like making a good first impression, right? The first 30 seconds to minute or two, like we said last week, that's the most important. Because in the first couple of minutes, people form a strong first impression, and it's hard to get rid of that afterwards. You could be with them for half an hour. If you came off on the wrong foot in the first 2 minutes, very hard to undo that. And vice versa. If you came off on a very positive light in the first minute or two, again, also very hard to undo that. Okay, so this is why the first, whether it's making an impression or creating a document, the first, few minutes, or in this case, the first few paragraphs, are the most important by far. Now, once you have the information down on paper, we now need to start editing. This is where this next section comes into play. We're talking about editing. Okay, once you have first cut out your document, you start editing. Look at the outline you initially created. Make sure no points are left out, no major points are left out. Right? Also ensure that the document is organized in the same structure as the outline. That's the whole point of the outline. Otherwise, what was the point of it, right? Okay, at the moment, during this stage, don't worry too much about the exact verbiage or paragraph length, right? As you're going to get to that later on during the revision process. Right now, the goal is just to make sure you have all the information there. Your document matches the organization of the outline, right? All of that. You don't focus as much on the exact, word choice or paragraph length. Okay, make sure that you hone in on these items while editing as well, right? So grammar, punctuation, right? We said don't spend too much time on the exact word choice, but that's still different than, that's just a matter of taste. This is a matter of right and wrong. Right? If the punctuation, there's a period missing, something is spelled incorrectly, right? That's just wrong. So we have to fix this at the moment. Okay, these are black and white issues, right? If something is just wrong, if you have a run-on sentence, right? These are black and white. I mean, we have to make sure grammatically and from a spelling point of view, things are correct, things are perfect. You definitely don't want to be making mistakes on spelling, punctuation, grammar, things like this. And again, don't rely on spell check. Right, the built-in spell check in Word or PowerPoint may not identify all errors. You can use it, of course. I'm not saying don't use it. Definitely hit spell check, right? Hit grammar check, but that's just a secondary backup in a sense, right? It's still up to you to verify everything, to verify the grammar, to verify the spelling. Okay, keep in mind that grammar is a brand ambassador. Okay, even if the meaning is clear, improper grammar sends a very negative message to the reader. Right? They're going to take you less seriously if there's bad grammar. Right? The big point here is that not only will your message potentially be misconstrued, even if it's not, more importantly, the reader will take what you wrote much less seriously, and you want to come across as the authority on the topic. Okay, someone who can, who the client, for example, can trust. Right? So this is also why you have to really make sure that it's not just to impress your associate or VP. Right? In the long run, it's really to make sure that whoever you're communicating the document to, whoever you're writing it for, whether, on the sell side, it's for a potential buyer, whether during a pitch, it's for the company you're trying to win business with, right? Whoever it is, you want to make sure they look at you as a trusted advisor, as a trusted, employee, basically, right? So this is why you have to keep in mind that proper spelling, grammar, punctuation, all of that, they're all brand ambassadors. It signals trust. Hey, they know you do good work. They can rely on you. And they feel safe hiring from you, retaining your services in banking, for example, right? All of that. Here's a grocery list of reasons why you don't want to rely on grammar check. Right? And we specifically gave you this. I know I mentioned a few things earlier, but we gave you a nice list here of reasons why you really don't want to rely on grammar check. Okay, they're there to help you, spell check and grammar check both, but you can't rely on them, right, as a method to ensure your document is free of spelling and grammatical mistakes, because there still might be some mistakes, right? As it says here, right, it might skip some sentence fragments, might not recognize run-ons. If the sentence is too long, it might just say it's okay when it's not, and vice versa. It's not going to distinguish between passive and active voices, right? If the pronoun's incorrect. But these are the kinds of things that may not pick up on. All right, now we're going to really start to get into the finer points of grammar, right? Much of which you've learned in school, but there could be some new stuff here if you haven't seen this stuff in a while. Just make sure you're paying attention, right? Could be some new stuff here you haven't seen. So let's get going now with pronouns. Pronoun usage. Just a couple of things to point out. First, the subject of a sentence, what is that? That's the person or thing that performs the action of the verb. Okay, so subject pronouns, the subject itself, that's just the person or thing that performs the action, right? But the subject pronoun replaces the subject, which is a person or thing. Okay, so what's an example? The best way to really illustrate a lot of this stuff is via examples. So what's an example? Well, instead of saying Maria is tall and Maria is nice, we can say Maria is tall and she is nice. Well, in that case, the word she is the subject pronoun, right? Because it replaced Maria, right? Instead of saying Maria twice, we said Maria and then she. She is the subject pronoun in that case. Now, as it says on this page, subject pronouns are also used after linking verbs. And again, best way via example to illustrate. So, for example, the winner of the election is he, not him. That might seem counterintuitive. Many of you might say, oh, well, I would normally just say the winner of the election is him. That's grammatically incorrect. The winner of the election is he or she, not him or her, right? In this case, the word he is the subject pronoun because it follows the linking verb is, right? If I said, who is the winner of the election? Would you say her is the winner of the election? No, you would say she is the winner of the election grammatically, right? Or he is the winner of the election. So therefore, if you flip it, the other way to say it is the winner of the election is, if you didn't want to say the person's name, Maria or John or something, you could say the winner of the election is he. Grammatically, that's correct. Not the winner of the election is him, because you would never say him is the winner, right? So it has to work both ways. And that's the test, right? So if you can't say him is the winner, you wouldn't say the winner is him. You would say the winner is he, because he is the winner. Okay, so notice that the pronoun must agree with the antecedent in both number and gender. What is the antecedent? That's the word the pronoun stands for, right? So both the number and gender. It must be consistently plural or singular. Can't mix and match. Okay, now in contrast to a subject pronoun, which is the subject of a sentence, an object pronoun receives the action of the verb. Okay, so what's the example? Well, I complimented John, right? In that sentence, what's the subject pronoun? I. But if I reverse it and I say John complimented me, what's the object pronoun? It's me. So I complimented John. I is the subject pronoun. In John complimented me, me is the object pronoun, right? Because it's receiving the action, right? The compliment that John gave me, right? So if you said John complimented, instead of me, you said John complimented her, well, then the object pronoun would be her. Okay. Next, if the pronoun is the subject of the sentence, choose the subject pronoun like we saw on the prior slide. If a pronoun follows a linking verb, choose the subject pronoun. However, if the pronoun receives the action of the verb or is the object of the preposition, choose the object pronoun. Okay, and keep in mind that linking verbs, right? Like for the prior page, we said examples were things like am, is, are, was, were, right? These are examples of linking verbs, right? So in the example, Alexander punched me. Alexander is the subject, punched is the verb, and me is the object pronoun. Okay, because again, me is receiving the action, right? Now, next page here. To be honest, half the battle without memorizing each and every, there's tons of grammatical points, as you can imagine. I mean, if you pick up a grammar book or an English book, textbook, I mean, to be honest, there's, probably hundreds of pages of these types of rules you can memorize, right? But I would say a lot of it involves not memorizing, but just making sure that the sentence sounds correct. That's half the battle. Now, listen carefully as you read each sentence and ask yourself one question. Does this sound correct? That's all you have to ask yourself. Look at this page, page 26. Look at the sentences we have. The MD and I went for lunch last week. Why is it not? And I've seen mistakes made with all of these types of examples all the time. We see this. Would you ever say the MD and me went for lunch? You might say, yeah, it doesn't sound that bad. The MD and me went for lunch. I mean, you might say that, right? And again, in conversation, that's one thing. But if you're just passing a friend and saying that quickly, but in writing, it's another. Right? So the MD and I went for lunch. Why? Would you ever say me went to lunch? Or me went for lunch? No. So because you would never say me went for lunch, you would never say the MD and me went for lunch. Because you would say I went to lunch. You have to say the MD and I went for lunch, right? That's the way you want to think about it. Replace the plural subjects, right? The two subjects with a singular, just with one subject. And then ask yourself how that would read. Okay, so the director gave Susan and me a project to complete by next week. So Susan and me are the objects of the verb gave. Right? The director gave who? Susan and me. Okay, the object receives the action of the verb, which is gave. So the objects are Susan and me. Would you ever say the director gave I a project? No, it just sounds funny, right? So you would never say the director gave Susan and I a project. You would start a sentence off with Susan and I. If you say Susan and I went to lunch, then that works. Susan and I went to lunch. But here, Susan and I are not the subjects. They're actually objects. So that's why it's Susan and me, because as we saw on the prior slide 24, me is the object pronoun, I is the subject pronoun, right? So we have to know when to use the subject pronoun and when the object pronoun is used. Okay, in the first example, it's I, it's the subject pronoun. In the second example, me is an object pronoun because it receives the action of the verb gave, the subject being the director. Third example, the strategy session for Brian and me lasted 2 hours. Would you ever say the strategy session for I lasted 2 hours? No. So you would not say Brian and I, you would say Brian and me. Again, they're objects of the preposition for. So object pronoun is needed.
Quick question. Could you say the strategy session for me and Brian lasted 2 hours, or are you?
Nope, you don't want, well, okay, I see what you're saying. So the strategy session for me and Brian, technically you should say Brian and me. It's like at the top, right? You wouldn't say, instead of the MD and I went for lunch, you wouldn't say I and the MD went for lunch, right? The same concept here. You want to put me or I last. You want to put the other people first.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, so you don't want to say the strategy session for me and Brian, just like you wouldn't say I and Brian went for lunch. You would say Brian and I went for lunch. Same thing here. You would say the strategy session for Brian and me. So you always want to throw me or I after the other words, if that makes sense. Okay.
That makes sense.
Like you just like when we were all taught, like growing up, right, in school, never start a sentence with what? Don't say me and John went for lunch or something, right? You would say, hey, John and I went for, or you wouldn't say I and John went for lunch. You would say John and I, right? We were always taught to put I at the end. It's the same concept here, whether it's at the top as subject pronouns or in the middle as object. Either way, in the third example, you would you always stick me or I like at the end of that list, not at the beginning. So yeah, just general rule of thumb. Yep. Okay, perfect. So last example, guys, neither the congressman nor the people whom he represented approve of the bill. You want to use whom because it's the object of the verb represented. Okay, so modifiers. There's a lot of rules here again. You don't necessarily have to memorize every single one, but having a good understanding will just help your writing. Does anyone make mistakes on the job? Of course, we see MBs making mistakes all the time with things in this presentation, all the time. So it's not like, oh, by the time you get to MD, your writing is going to be absolutely flawless and you're never going to make a mistake. That's not the goal. The goal is to just make sure that you understand in general, right, most of these rules and you apply them, you think through them, carefully as you're writing. Okay, but it doesn't mean mistakes aren't made on the job. Of course they are. People are human, right? So yeah, you will see your clients, you will see MBs, you will see VPs making mistakes. But again, the better writing you have, the better off you'll be in the long run, right? You obviously want to try to minimize mistakes if possible. Okay, so keep going here. Okay, so now we're going to get into modifiers. All right, so now in terms of modifiers, modifier just describes another word or phrase, right? And they should be ideally close to the word or phrase they're describing. Could be a single adjective, single adverb, right? Phrases, okay, any of this. Now, you might see something here called participial phrase. What is that? Okay, so you see phrases, prepositional, infinitive. What's a participial phrase? Well, it's a phrase that looks like a verb, but actually functions as an adjective. It modifies a noun, right? You can basically spice up a noun, if that makes sense. So what's an example? Well, fond of, brushing her hair, comma. Kelly always had, smooth locks, right? Just in terms of hair. Well, in that case, fond of brushing her hair, that's describing Kelly and that, Kelly's hair, right? So in that sense, that phrase, fond of brushing her hair, would be the participial phrase. Another example, the trash can sat in the corner, comma, brimming with garbage. Well, in that case, the trash can sat in the corner, that's the main sentence, right? But comma, brimming with garbage, that's just describing the trash can. So that whole phrase, brimming with garbage, is basically a participial phrase. Like, that's all we mean. And again, it's things like this where I would say, don't get too bogged down. And I mean, we're getting into the finer points of grammar here. Don't worry too much about each and every one of these terms and, be able to think of 1,000 examples of each. That's not the goal. It's just to make sure you understand the big points and make sure that, at the end of the day, you're constructing your sentences and paragraphs in a very organized and, hopefully grammatically correct fashion. That's the idea. If you don't necessarily know from a grammar standpoint what the difference between a prepositional and a participial phrase is, that's not the goal, right? It's to just make sure that when you're writing clearly and grammatically correct overall. Okay, so, and clear. That's the other thing, clear. You have to make sure your sentences and paragraphs are really clear. Okay, so here's an example of a misplaced modifier. Working hard and paying attention, I saw my colleagues make progress. What's the problem here? Working hard and paying attention, comma, I saw my colleagues make progress. Wait a second, who was working hard and paying attention? Was it me? No, it was my colleagues. But then how come that phrase before the word I? You see the problem? So this makes it seem like I was working hard and paying attention. So it kind of confuses the reader a bit. Now you might look at it and say, oh, but I know what's going on. Sure. But at the end of the day, you want to avoid writing like this because it might confuse the reader. And here it might be more obvious than another example. But the point is, you want to really write as clearly as possible. Okay, you want to emphasize that the colleagues were working hard and paying attention, not you. So the way to revise it is at the bottom. I saw my hardworking, attentive colleagues make progress. Or you can say, I saw my colleagues who were working hard and paying attention, comma, make progress. But again, that would involve sticking that phrase in the middle and breaking out the sentence, I saw my colleagues make progress, right? So either way is fine, but just make sure that, you don't do it the way we do it at the top, because that's very unclear. And it makes it seem like I was the one working hard and paying attention, not the colleagues. And it seems, again, silly, but we see this kind of writing all the time, and you can imagine in a big document how confusing this could get. All right, now let's get to the commas. So many of you may have heard of the Oxford Rule. Okay, all we're saying here is place a comma after each item in a series, including the one that precedes the conjunction. That's what the Oxford Rule states. There's two examples at the bottom. They check the tires, oil, and battery before you make a long trip. You see the comma after oil. And you may have trouble driving if you are texting your friend, adjusting a seat, and reading your email. You see the comma after seat, right? This is technically correct, but if you choose not to put the last comma in there and obey this this Oxford rule, which I mean, frankly, everyone doesn't do it this way, just be consistent. And that's the biggest thing we always stress in general, whether it's a PowerPoint deck, an Excel model, a Word document, doesn't matter. Be consistent. If you choose to do things a little bit differently, as long as it's not, you know, technically incorrect, right? And this could, I mean, I guess you could argue this is technically incorrect, not putting a comma there, but a lot of people just don't do that and, you know, don't follow the Oxford rule. So, hey, what I would say for something like this is one of those things where even though it's not technically correct, if you didn't put that comma there at the end, as long as you're consistent throughout your document, you should be okay. Again, unless, you know, your VP comes by and says, well, no, we're going to obey the Oxford rule, then go ahead, right, and do it. But the point is, in a lot of cases, you might have leeway for things like this, but just be consistent. The last thing you want to do is say, yeah, you know what, every other sentence, I'm going to use the Oxford rule. That's a disaster, right? Because then, you know, your document's very inconsistent in terms of how it's, you know, following the rules. So, okay, commas used in serials here, we're going to focus primarily on, you know, American English rules, but just note that, you know, if you're working with a client that's based in London, for example, right, British English uses commas less than American English. Okay, so that's something to just keep in mind. Now, next page here. Okay, and a positive is a noun or noun phrase that renames another noun right before it. Okay, you want to use a comma before and after the appositive. So during the dinner conversation, the young analyst, a graduate of Penn, asked the associate if he had accepted the position of VP. Note the use of commas around a graduate of Penn. Okay, that's an appositive of analyst. It's describing, renaming the analyst. You can notice there's no comma after associate, right? Because the subordinate clause, if he had accepted the position of VP, comes at the end of the sentence. The commas and interrupters. Okay, interrupters should be separated by commas. Look at the examples at the bottom, right? Interrupter is just a non-essential word or phrase. Okay, when it comes at the beginning of a sentence, you want a comma after it, right? If it's in the middle, you want it both before and after it, right? So at the bottom, however, comma, the stock market is always volatile during a global crisis. You have one comma there, right? But if the word however is in the middle, you need it both before and after. So the stock market, comma, however, comma, is always volatile during a global crisis. You need it both before and after the interrupter if it's in the middle. Now, subordinate clause, it does not express a complete thought and cannot stand by itself. Okay, so you want to place a comma after it if it begins a sentence. Okay, so whenever the president takes a client to lunch at her club, comma, she and the client may meet many interesting people who want to speak with both of them. Okay, it's after the subordinate clause at the beginning of the sentence. But there's no comma when the subordinate clause, who want to speak with both of them, is at the end of the sentence. It's only if it's at the beginning. Now, make sure you do not place a comma between the modifier and the word it is modifying. Right? No need for a comma between fluffy and pony. You don't want to say the fat, comma, brown, comma, fluffy, comma, pony, right? You want to say the fat, comma, brown, comma, and then fluffy, pony with no comma between fluffy and pony. You can look at fat, brown, fluffy, pony as one continuous phrase, right? No need for and in there anywhere as well. But so you don't need to say the fat, brown, and fluffy pony. Okay, another use of comma here involves separating two independent clauses that can stand on their own. Okay, so an example is the theater will be torn down, comma, and a rehabilitation center will be put in its place. Right? Notice that those two phrases can actually, those two clauses can actually stand on their own, right? You can say the theater will be torn down, period. That's a complete sentence. You can say a rehabilitation center will be put in its place. That's also a complete sentence. The commas can be used to separate a subordinate clause at the beginning of a sentence from a main clause. Okay, but no comma is needed if the subordinate clause comes at the end. Look at the example at the bottom. Because Marvin led the team in new investment accounts, comma, he was given an all expenses paid trip to Cancun. But what if you flip it? No comma then. Marvin was given the all expenses paid trip to Cancun because he led the team in new investment accounts. Right? Then you don't need a comma because the subordinate clause is at the end. It's only if it's at the beginning that you need a comma. All right, now let's get into apostrophes here. A few slides on this. These are the most common areas. They're not the only ones, right? With things like this, there's dozens of words in the English language, if not hundreds, but these are the most common ones that cause issues, which we see all the time. Okay, with apostrophes. So basically, let's go through these. I mean, hopefully a lot of this will kind of come back to you from your English and grammar classes, but just make sure that if something's new here, if something's not clear, you're writing it down, asking questions. It's and it's. The IT apostrophe S, that's a contraction that stands for it is and it has, right? ITS, all one word without any apostrophe. That's a possessive pronoun that shows ownership. If I said it's raining outside, because you can replace that with it is raining outside, you would say IT apostrophe S. But if I said, look at the door, its handle is broken, that its would be ITS without the apostrophe because it's a possessive pronoun, in which case it's is describing the door. So you would just say ITS. Anytime you can break out it's into it has or it is, you want to use IT apostrophe S. That's the bottom line. Okay, next page here, apostrophe to show possession. This is a tricky one, but the bottom line is, and you see all the examples on this page, right? For singular nouns that don't end in S, add S, girl's coat, right? GIRL, apostrophe S. Okay, then you have classes schedule, right? That's where you want to add apostrophe S at the end. For plural nouns, add an S, that end in an S, add an apostrophe rather. So two elephants trunks, right? With an S apostrophe, not another S after the elephants, an apostrophe. And then for plural nouns that don't end in an S, simply add the S, so women's coats, right, with an apostrophe S at the end of women. Right, don't use an apostrophe to form a plural. Right, so you would never say the goats went over the bridge with goat apostrophe S. You would just say goats without the apostrophe, right? Essentially, the bottom line is that the only situation where you do need, or rather where you do not need to add an S is where you have a plural noun that ends in S, like elephants trunks or cars bumpers. Look at all of those cars bumpers. For example, you would just say cars apostrophe bumpers. Look at all those elephants trunks. You would say elephants apostrophe trunks. Okay, that's the only situation where you do not need to add an S. In every other case, you saw how we added an S. All right, we discussed this briefly earlier, but there, and there, right? THERE shows location. It's an adverb that shows location. THEIR shows possession, like their car had a flat tire and resulted in a delay to their trip. THEY apostrophe R is a contraction that can be broken down into they are. Okay, so they're willing to meet with the audience after the class has been presented. So you can break down, anytime you can break down there into they are, you can use THEY apostrophe RE. This is, of course, one of the most common mistakes in all of mankind. It irritates me to this day. Every day I see at least one person in some way, shape, or form using this incorrectly. Your, Y-O-U-R, shows possession. Y-O-U apostrophe R-E is a contraction for U-R. Anytime you can break apart your into U-R, you want to use Y-O-U apostrophe R-E. Okay, so my apologies for raiding your fridge and eating all of your food. That shows possession, just YOUR. But you are not allowed to play outside until you're done with your homework, because you could break those yours down into you are, right? You could say you are not allowed to play outside until you are done with your homework. You would use YOU''RE. These are other confusing and misused words. Okay, just a grocery list here. Okay, nothing to go over at the moment, but just, just a lot more. And like I said, there's dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of words that cause issues. This is just another, secondary list of them here. The ones we went over, I'd say, are probably the most common, but there's a lot of issues here as well, like then and then. A lot of people make mistakes with those too, right? Then versus than. With than, THAN, right? That shows comparison, comparing two items. Then, right? That's more sequential, right? Hey, do this, then do something else, right? That's THEN, right? So there's things like that. I would just make sure that you know the difference between all of the items on this page as well. Revising a document. Okay, revision requires detachment. Okay, put yourself in the reader's position and then see the document through their eyes, right? Don't take pride of authorship here, right? This is business writing. You, in many cases in banking especially, you're working on a document with several other people on your team, right? So don't, take pride of authorship. Everyone's working on the same document, that's fine. Okay, when revising a document, okay, you're not just looking for blatant errors, but also checking to see if the ideas are being expressed clearly. Remember, during the editing process, that's why you weren't focusing too much on the exact verbiage and things like that. Well, you are doing that here. Okay, so are the sentences clear? Are there any errors? Of course, that you're checking at every step in the way. If you see an error, of course, fix it. Okay, but now you're getting into more of the nitty gritty of the detail. Hey, are the paragraphs structured the way I want them to? Are they long enough? Am I using the right verbiage? Things like that. Okay, more issues here, right? Did you use appropriate transitions? Do the sentences have parallel construction? Okay, have you chosen strong verbs? Okay, the best possible verbs for that, for that situation. Just make sure you're using the right verbiage, your sentences are flowing smoothly, the organization makes sense, it ties to the outline, all of that. Your sentences should vary in length. You want to engage the reader, right? So have short sentences, have some long sentences. Keep in mind, long sentences are fine as long as they're clear and provide a lot of helpful information. Don't just construct long sentences for the sake of doing so, only if they really add value though. That's what I would say to that. Active versus passive voice. Passive voice is fine, it's grammatically correct, and that's one of those things grammar check won't pick up on, but active voice is a lot more effective and adds energy, right? So look at the top. Active voice means the subject completes the action. The VP questioned the analyst. A lot more energetic and direct rather than the passive voice. Analyst was questioned by the VP, right? In which the subject is acted upon. The passive voice, like I said, it's not grammatically incorrect, it's grammatically correct, but it's just a bit more indirect and vague, right? So if you can use active voice in general, hey, we're always an advocate of that. Okay, eliminate prepositional phrases. Okay, a prepositional phrase begins with a preposition, ends with a noun. For many times, the same information can be communicated with fewer words. But here are examples here on the next page. Okay, so instead of saying the watch was obviously designed by a master craftsman, you can say a master craftsman had obviously designed the watch. See how much more clear that is, right? There's a few more examples here as well, but look at the last one. That's an extreme example, but you'll see that, they're omitting unnecessary words and phrasing things in an active voice stance is a lot better. So it is a matter of the gravest possible importance to the health of anyone with the history of a problem with disease of the heart, right? You can see that sentence is extremely long and unnecessary. You change all of that simply to one line. Anyone with a history of heart disease should avoid saturated fats, direct to the point, much more clear. And this is why writing is important. You can see the difference between the example and revision at the bottom and the last example. Big difference, right? Okay, and that's the point that, and we see, the first one might seem silly, no one would ever write like that, you might say, but you'd be surprised that sometimes people just try to sound overly fancy and overly wordy, but it ends up actually becoming confusing sometimes. So that's where, just to be clean and to the point, is often a better approach than being overly verbose. Okay, so now parallel construction, few slides on this, and then we'll call it a day. So there's some sections in the back you guys can go through as well. There's a ton of slides on like subject verb agreement, all of that, but let's at least go through the parallel construction section here. In general, expressions should be outwardly similar. What does that mean? Well, the first example, it's not parallel because you have a noun and an adjective describing it. It was both a long assembly and very dull. The problem here is that in this sentence, the pronoun it is described with a noun and an adjective connected with and, right? Because it's being described with assembly and then dull. Assembly is a noun, dull is an adjective. That's not parallel. Parallel meaning it has to be the same. They either both have to be adjectives or nouns. So look at the bottom. We replaced it so that they're both adjectives. Assembly is now the subject, and we have two adjectives, long and dull. Okay, now the subjects are, rather the adjectives describing the subject are now parallel, right? Because they're both adjectives, not one adjective, one noun. Okay, same thing here on the next page, right? At the top, you see the Greeks, the Serbians, and Lebanese planned a cultural festival. The problem with that is you need the word the in front of Lebanese. You have to use the, right, that article in front of each noun. So we need the Greeks, the Serbians, and the Lebanese. At the bottom, the baby flung spaghetti strands on the walls, the counters and under the table. You say on the walls, you say under the table, but then you say the counters. You have to say on the counters. Again, it might seem silly, but this is the grammatically correct way of doing it. But you just have to make sure you're exhibiting parallel construction throughout the writing process. Okay, here, notice the difference. I would rather pay for my education than financial aid. It's not parallel because the verb in front of education, there's a verb there, right? But not in front of financial aid. So what you want to do is say, I would rather pay for my education than receive financial aid. You're not paying for financial aid. You're paying for the education. You're receiving financial aid. Well, you have to put the verb there. So now you have two verbs in front of for my education and financial aid, right? Pay and receive respectively. So now it's parallel. Okay, when two or more phrases are joined with a coordinating conjunction, use parallel construction. So for example, my best friend took me ice skating and to a musical. Let's revise it. My best friend took me to the ice rink and to a musical. You see the difference? Okay, by eliminating ice skating and replacing with ice rink, the word and, okay, ends up joining two prepositional phrases. To the ice rink, to a musical. Otherwise, ice skating is in parallel with to a musical, okay, if that makes sense. So you really want to ensure parallel construction throughout your writing process. Okay, so that's going to conclude what we've done here. You have a number of slides here now. There's a ton of subject verb agreement rules. Specifically, there's 11 rules here, right? A lot of stuff going on here. So make sure you guys go through this. And just to kind of wrap up here in terms of grand finale, the bottom line is, can you answer yes to all of the above statements? Okay. Can you make sure that the design's clean, it's readable, the document matches the outline? Okay, all of your points relate back to the main topic that you identify up front in the first paragraph on the first page. You make sure you fix all the errors. You have appropriate transitions, supporting details are clearly stated. Your paragraphs are well developed. Right? Only after you ask yourself these questions, and then you can say yes to all of them. Only after that are you done. Okay, that's really important. Okay, so the bottom line is, once you're through the document, take one final look, be able to say yes to all these questions, and then you can hand off the document to your client or your boss. Okay, guys, thank you very much. Are there any questions here before we conclude?
Okay, I'm not hearing any. So
Perfect.
I guess we are good.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time here today. Hope you guys all have a great day. And you guys do have my email address. So if you have any questions at all, going forward, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, the point of all of these sessions is to make sure you guys all do really well going forward and succeed professionally. Okay, so to the extent you need anything from us, that's what we're here for, and happy to help. So feel free to reach out, and happy to help with anything you guys might need. All right, guys, have a wonderful day, wonderful rest of your week, and hopefully I'll see you guys on a future seminar.
You have a good rest of your day as well. Thank you.
Thank you.